On July 17, 1917, at Buckingham Palace, George V sat at his desk and signed a document that erased his own family's name. The proclamation was short. The language was constitutional, measured, drained of feeling. It declared that the royal house and family would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor, and that the descendants of Queen Victoria, who were subjects of the crown, would relinquish their German titles and dignities. Outside, London was 5 weeks past the Gotha bomber raids that had killed children in a Poplar schoolroom. Inside, the ink dried on a word, Windsor, that had not existed as a dynastic name until a committee selected it from a list of candidates that included Tudor, Plantagenet, and Fitzroy. The king was 52 years old. He did not look up. The cousins, brothers in law, nieces, and nephews, whose inherited identities were being dissolved by the document in front of him, had already been told. What the public saw was a rebrand, a wartime housekeeping measure, the monarchy tidying itself for a country at war. What had actually happened was more intimate and more savage. A family had ranked its own members by proximity to the throne and decided which of them could keep their names and which would have to absorb the loss. The people being erased were not enemy outsiders. They were men and women who had spent decades in British uniform, in British service, proving they belonged. This is the story of that erasure and of the name that refused to stay buried. It spans 100 years, 12 lives, 2 world wars, and 3 generations of a family taught that belonging was earned through service and revoked by paperwork. It ends not with a restoration, but with a hyphen. To understand why a king believed a surname could endanger a throne, you have to go back further than the war and further than the panic. You have to go back to the particular world that made that panic possible. A world in which the British crown was, by blood and by marriage, one of the most German institutions in the country. That is not rhetoric, it is genealogy. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840, the British royal house acquired a dynastic name that was thoroughly, unmistakably German. Albert was a prince of a small Thuringian duchy. His ancestry was Saxon, his first language was German. And when he married the Queen of England, his family's name attached itself to the British crown with a permanence that nobody at the time had reason to question. It was not a secret and it was not a scandal. It was simply how European monarchy worked. Bloodlines crossing borders the way trade routes cross seas. Royal marriages binding one court to another in a web of shared ancestry and shared interest that had nothing to do with the national feelings of ordinary people and everything to do with the dynastic logic of thrones. Victoria's children married into the houses of Germany, Russia, Denmark, and Hesse. Her grandchildren married further still. By the time her great-grandchildren were being born in the early 20th century, the family tree of the British crown resembled less an English oak than a root system spreading under every throne on the continent. The Kaiser was a grandson of Victoria. The Tsarina was a granddaughter. The kings of Norway, Spain, and Romania were connected by marriage or descent. Monarchy in this era operated not as a collection of national brands, but as a single, interconnected family business. And the British branch of that business spoke German at home, more often than the public knew, kept German relatives closer than the public imagined, and bore a German house name that in peacetime seemed merely ornamental and in wartime would seem like a provocation. That root system is where this story begins. Not at Buckingham Palace in the summer of 1917, but in the drawing rooms, nurseries, palaces, and naval stations, where 2 particular branches of Victoria's extended world were growing into lives that would collide spectacularly with the politics of national identity. The first branch was tech, the second was Battenberg. Between them, they would produce a queen consort, a first sea lord, a future queen of Sweden, a future grandmother of Prince Philip, and a boy who would grow up to become Earl Mountbatten of Burma, all of them carrying, in those years before the war, surnames that sounded like home in Hesse and sounded like the enemy in Poplar. Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge was a granddaughter of King George III, large in personality, generous in spirit, expansive in social ambition, and catastrophically unable to live within her income. She married Prince Francis, Duke of Teck, a man from a morganatic line of the House of Württemberg. Morganatic. The word matters because it explains a great deal about the anxiety that would shape the next generation. A morganatic marriage was a union between persons of unequal rank. and the children of such a marriage did not inherit the higher-ranking parents' full titles or succession rights. Francis's parents had married across that invisible line, and the stain of the inequality followed the children into every court in Europe. The Techs were royal enough by blood, but compromised by technicality, which placed them in a particular kind of social purgatory. Too grand for ordinary life, not quite grand enough for the front row of royalty. They lived at Kensington Palace and at White Lodge in Richmond Park on a parliamentary annuity of £5,000 a year, supplemented by the generosity of Mary Adelaide's mother, the Duchess of Cambridge. It was not poverty. It was poverty's well-dressed neighbor. The particular insecurity of titled people who had pedigree without commensurate cash, who moved through palaces they could not afford to heat properly, and attended ceremonies at which they ranked just below the people who could. And the debts were real. Mary Adelaide spent with a freedom that her income could not support. And by the 1880s, the situation had deteriorated enough to require what amounted to a financial retreat. The Techs left England for Florence, a genteel exile dressed up as continental travel, a long European sojourn that fooled nobody in the family and embarrassed everyone who understood what it signified. They were not tourists, they were people who could not afford to stay home. The future Queen of England spent part of her adolescence in rented rooms in Italy, learning what happens when royal dignity collides with an overdrawn account and dignity loses. Their eldest daughter, Princess Victoria Mary, was born on May 26, 1867, at Kensington Palace. She would later be called May by the family. She would become Queen Mary. She would become one of the most formidable figures in the modern history of the British monarchy. But her childhood formed her in ways that the public would never fully see. She grew up watching her mother charm rooms that her father's rank could not quite command, watching money disappear into social obligations that could not be refused, watching the complicated machinery of royal adjacency, close enough to the throne to feel its gravity, not close enough to share its security. The Florentine exile consolidated something in her. It hardened a temperament that would later appear as emotional coldness, as a containment so severe it could look like indifference, but was in truth something closer to vigilance. Mary did not sentimentalize monarchy. She studied it the way a structural engineer studies a bridge, for its load-bearing capacity, its points of stress, its susceptibility to forces that most people never think about until the thing collapses. By the time she married into the direct line of succession, she had already absorbed a lesson that would define her public life, that a royal family survives not on affection, but on usefulness, and usefulness demands the willingness to sacrifice whatever the institution requires, including parts of yourself. Her brothers would eventually learn what this sacrifice looked like from the other side. Adolphus, Duke of Teck, born in 1868, grew into a soldier and courtier of quiet, reliable service, but the sort of man who made himself indispensable without ever becoming conspicuous. He served in the British Army. He became governor of Windsor Castle, embedded in the ceremonial and administrative machinery of the crown itself. He was inside the building, literally and figuratively. His uniforms were British. His loyalties were beyond question. His name was in the court circular. By the time the crisis arrived, he had spent decades proving that Teck was not a foreign word, but a family one. His younger brother, Alexander, born on April 14, 1874, at Kensington Palace, was cut from sharper cloth, an Eton and Sandhurst product with military precision, and an imperial career ahead of him. Alexander possessed the Teck gift for adaptation, the ability to fit himself to whatever shape the institution needed, to keep serving, keep appearing, keep being useful under whatever conditions the state imposed. That gift would serve him well. He would eventually govern South Africa and Canada as the Crown's representative, a professional servant of the British state, wearing a name that the state had chosen for him. The second branch grew from different soil but faced the same crack in the earth. In 1854 in Graz, a boy named Ludwig was born into the Battenberg line of the House of Hesse. His father, Prince Alexander of Hesse and by Rhine, had made a morganatic marriage to Countess Julia von Hauke, and the children of that union had been given the title Battenberg, a name that carried Hessian grandeur and morganatic limitation in almost equal measure. Like the text, the Battenbergs were close enough to royal status to taste it and not quite senior enough to take it for granted. Young Ludwig, who would become Louis, was brought to England in 1868, naturalized as a British subject at the age of 14, and entered the Royal Navy the same year. He was not visiting. He was not observing from a comfortable royal distance. He was converting, placing himself inside an institution that would become his identity so completely that decades later, the attempt to separate him from it would feel less like bureaucratic adjustment and more like amputation. Over the next 4 decades, Louis of Battenberg built a career of remarkable distinction. He rose through the ranks with a competence and a steadiness that had nothing to do with royal patronage and everything to do with an aptitude for command and an instinct for the sea. He was not a dilettante prince playing at naval service. He was a professional officer who happened to have been born into a morganatic German family and who had decided as a teenager that Britain would be his country and the Navy would be his proof of it. That proof accumulated year by year, posting by posting, until by the early 1900s, Louis was one of the most senior and respected officer in the fleet. He married Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine on April 30th, 1884. Victoria had been born on April 5th, 1863, at Windsor Castle, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria through her second daughter, Princess Alice. She was intelligent in the way that courts require intelligence, not academic but observational, alert to hierarchy, to power, to the invisible currents of favor and disfavor that determine who mattered and who could be set aside. She understood the geography of European royalty from the inside, knew its rules, knew its fragilities, and knew, with a prescience that events would vindicate her, how rapidly the political weather could turn against people whose value the state had once taken for granted. She became a kind of ballast in the family, steady, socially literate, connected to every important drawing room in Europe, and clear-eyed enough to see what was coming before it arrived. Through her daughter Alice, she would eventually become the grandmother of Prince Philip, and therefore an ancestor embedded inside the modern royal line. The supposedly erased world would survive, in part because of her. Together, Louis and Victoria produced a family that straddled the borderland between British and foreign, between royal and not quite royal, between belonging and the perpetual need to prove that one did. Princess Alice, their eldest, born on February 25th, 1885, at Windsor Castle, married Prince Andrew of Greece in 1903 and moved into the volatile orbit of Hellenic royalty, a world of coups, exiles, and restorations that would provide the backdrop for one of the most extraordinary lives in modern royal history. Alice's future included exile from Greece, years of psychological struggle, extraordinary wartime courage in Nazi-occupied Athens, a late religious vocation, and ultimately a burial on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. She was not central to the paperwork of 1917. Her marriage had already shifted her formal style, but she carried the afterlife of the erased name forward through decades of turbulence and deposited its genetic and emotional residue inside the house that had tried to bury it. Princess Louise, born on July 13th, 1889, was quieter than Alice, but no less important to the story's meaning, because her experience would provide one of the sharpest single images of what the 1917 crisis actually cost in human terms. Before the renaming, she was Princess Louise of Battenberg. After it, she would be Lady Louise Mountbatten, the same blood, the same ancestry, the same family, but grammatically diminished, her title rewritten downward by administrative decision. The change of address was social descent made legible in a form of words. Her eventual marriage to Crown Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden in 1923 would restore her to royal status, but that restoration only deepened the absurdity. A woman born a princess, demoted by wartime politics, then re-elevated by a foreign marriage. Her identity had been rewritten twice in 6 years by forces that had nothing to do with who she was and everything to do with what her surname sounded like. Then there was Alexander of Battenberg, born on November 23rd, 1886, at Windsor Castle, a grandson of Queen Victoria through Princess Beatrice. Alexander's thread in this story is particularly sharp because his transformation would be visible in almost real time. He would become Alexander Mountbatten on July 14th, 1917, and marry Lady Irene Denison just 5 days later, a wedding in which the groom walked into the chapel under a name that was less than a week old. That juxtaposition gives the script one of its most cinematic beats, an aristocratic ritual of continuity performed inside the wreckage of an identity rewrite. Alexander was young enough, 30 at the time of the renaming, for the new name to define the rest of his adult life. He would be created Marquis of Carisbrooke, and the title would die with him in 1960, making his line a dead-end branch of the forced reinvention. Even the compensation proved temporary, and there was the youngest of Louis and Victoria's children, a boy born on June 25th, 1900, at Frogmore House, registered as His Serene Highness Prince Louis of Battenberg, who would grow up to become one of the most famous and most controversial figures in 20th century British public life. In those pre-war years, the younger Louis was a child. The name Mountbatten had not yet been invented. The career that would take him to the pinnacle of naval command, to the Viceroyalty of India, to the last days of the British Empire, and to a violent death in Ireland in 1979 had not yet begun. He was simply the youngest son of a naval family whose surname happened to sound German, that, as the next few years would demonstrate, was more than enough. The man at the center of the institution these families orbited was George Frederick Ernest Albert, born on June 3rd, 1865, at Marlborough House in London. The second son of the Prince of Wales, he was not supposed to be king. His elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, was the heir. George was the spare, the one directed toward the Royal Navy and away from the complexities of succession. He entered Britannia as a cadet at 12 and learned discipline, plain speaking, routine, and the particular naval habit of valuing competence over ornament. He was not brilliant. He was not theatrical. He was stubborn, dutiful, conservative in every instinct, and possessed of a rigidity that could look like strength or cruelty, depending on the angle of observation. His diary entries were terse. His temper was real. His affections were narrow. His sense of duty was total, and that totality would later allow him to do immensely difficult things to people he was fond of without showing much visible tenderness in the doing. In January 1892, Albert Victor died of pneumonia during an influenza epidemic at Sandringham. He was 28 years old, George was 26, and the trajectory of his life pivoted entirely. The sailor became the heir. The following year, on July 6, 1893, he married Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, the same Mary who had been informally engaged to his dead brother. That detail is worth pausing over. Mary had been selected for the monarchy once, had lost her intended to illness, and had been redirected toward the surviving brother as though dynastic purpose could simply be transferred from one body to the next, the way a commission passes to a new officer when the old one falls. Whether she loved George at the time of the wedding, or whether she accepted him because the alternative was a return to the tech finances and the social diminishment of a broken royal engagement, is a question the historical record does not resolve. What is not in dispute is that from the day of her marriage, Mary committed to the institution of monarchy with an intensity that went beyond wifely duty. She became its student, its defender, and its most unsentimental architect. George became Prince of Wales in 1901. He became king on May 6, 1910, when Edward VII died. He was 44, Mary was 43. They entered the role as a partnership built on shared conviction rather than visible warmth. The monarchy existed to endure, and endurance required control over image, over family, over the gap between what was real and what was shown. George's court was austere. His values were naval values. His idea of royal duty involved not the glamour of his father's Edwardian world, the house parties, the shooting weekends at Sandringham stocked with 1,000 birds, the mistresses accommodated with discretion, and society's winking approval, but a plainness that bordered on severity. He rose early. He answered correspondence. He kept his stamp collection in meticulous order. He expected punctuality from everyone around him and treated lateness as a form of moral failure. His children would later describe a father who was easier to respect than to love, whose idea of affection was a gruff acknowledgement, and whose idea of discipline left no room for appeal. Mary's contribution to the partnership was different in texture but identical in purpose. She brought an encyclopedic knowledge of royal history, a formidable memory for precedent, and the emotional discipline she had learned watching her parents fail at the one thing royalty could not afford to fail at: managing appearances. Where George governed through bluntness, Mary governed through silence, through the controlled absence of visible feeling that allowed her to function in situations where other people would have cracked. She did not weep in public. She rarely explained herself. She carried out her duties with a composure that some found admirable and others found chilling. And in the crisis ahead, that composure would serve the institution perfectly, even as it cost her brothers something irreplaceable. The severity of the household would serve George well when what was needed was institutional resolve. When what was needed was compassion, it would prove considerably less adequate. By December 1912, Louis of Battenberg had reached the summit. He was appointed First Sea Lord, the professional head of the Royal Navy, the highest uniform position in the service that had consumed his life since boyhood. He was 58 years old. He had spent 44 years earning the post. His appointment was the vindication of a career built on competence, on loyalty, on the steady accumulation of service that should have placed his Britishness beyond question. He stood at the top of a pillar constructed over half a century. He had no idea how little time was left before someone kicked it out from under him. Behind the scenes, another figure was already shaping the responses that the crisis ahead would demand. Arthur Bigg, Lord Stamfordham, born in 1849, had served the crown as private secretary since the reign of Queen Victoria, and by the time George V sat on the throne, Stamfordham was the most experienced operator inside the palace machinery. He was not royal. He was not aristocratic in the landed sense. He was a career courtier, the man who drafted memoranda, translated political moods into actionable advice, managed the correspondence between the palace and the government, and understood with a professional courtier's acuity that the monarchy survived not by asserting its grandeur, but by reading the room and adjusting before the room turned hostile. In the crisis that was coming, his fingerprints would be on every critical document, every naming proposal, every piece of bureaucratic choreography that converted a family's identity into a matter of state policy. Stamfordham was not the author of the tragedy, he was its stage manager. The court in those last pre-war years was a place of uniforms and drawing rooms, investitures and shooting parties, palace christenings, and naval reviews. The social machinery of a European empire turning with the well-oiled regularity that made the whole arrangement seem permanent. George and Mary presided with quiet discipline from Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, their household organized around the rhythms of the court calendar. Ascot in June, Cowes in August, Balmoral in autumn, Sandringham at Christmas. Louis served with distinction at the Admiralty. The Tech brothers moved through their ceremonial and military duties, Adolphus at Windsor Castle, Alexander through the parade grounds and officers' messes of an empire that had not yet begun to doubt itself. The Battenberg daughters circulated between London, Windsor, and the courts of Greece and the continent. Victoria of Hesse maintained the social connections that bound the family to cousins in Russia, in Germany, in Denmark, in Greece, the pan-European web of royal kinship that gave this world its particular texture. Nobody questioned the arrangement, nobody needed to. The financial architecture beneath these lives is worth understanding, because it explains both the family's resilience and its vulnerability. This was not a dynasty built on land. There was no single great estate generating thousands a year in rents, no ancestral seat around which the family's identity had accumulated over centuries. The Windsors, though they were not yet called that, drew their sustenance from the civil list, from parliamentary annuities, from crown properties that belonged to the institution rather than the individual, and from the salaries and emoluments attached to military and ceremonial positions. The Techs and the Battenbergs drew theirs from proximity to that central source. Court positions, naval pay, the occasional strategic marriage, and the unspoken understanding that the crown would look after its own as long as its own continued to be useful. It was a system that worked beautifully in peacetime. It assumed continuity. It assumed that the family's relationship with the state was settled, permanent, beyond the reach of public mood. That assumption was about to prove catastrophic. There was also an emotional architecture to these relationships, and it was built on the same foundation. The founding code of this family and the unspoken rule that governed how the Techs and Battenbergs understood their place was not privilege, it was usefulness. George had been formed by naval duty, by the expectation that a royal man earns his position through service rather than her entitlement. Louis of Battenberg had made himself useful to Britain by 44 years in uniform. Mary had learned that dignity must survive embarrassment, that a royal woman's value lies not in what she feels, but in what she endures. Adolphus and Alexander of Teck had built careers of steady, unshowy service. The Battenberg children were being raised in the same tradition, naval, discipline, oriented toward the institution rather than toward the self. They did not claim their places, they earned them, and because they had earned them, they believed their places were secure. The public image was persuasive precisely because it rested on that reality of service. These families were not idle. They were working members of a working institution. They wore uniforms, they launched ships, they attended state functions, they represented the crown at ceremonies, at military reviews, at the openings of hospitals and schools. The public, to the extent that it thought about the matter at all, saw people who appeared simply royal, not German, not Danish, not Hessian, but something above nationality, something that belonged to a world of crowns and pageantry that had always existed and surely always would. The family's German surnames were printed in Debrett's and Burke's, available to anyone who cared to look, but almost nobody looked. Why would they? The names were not a scandal. They were furniture. They had been there so long that they had become invisible. Somewhere in that invisible world, a thread was already being woven that would carry the whole story forward into the 21st century. On June 10th, 1921, still a few years into the future at this point in the narrative, but worth marking now, a boy would be born on a dining room table on the island of Corfu, the son of Princess Alice of Battenberg and Prince Andrew of Greece. His name would be Philip. His life would eventually complete the circle that George I's proclamation tried to close, bringing the Battenberg blood back into the direct royal line through marriage and giving the dynasty a hyphenated surname, Mountbatten Windsor, that would carry the 1917 wound permanently visible inside the family's official identity. That future was still hidden, but the people who would produce it were already in place, already marrying, already having children, already building the genealogical inevitability that no proclamation could permanently undo. But hairline fractures were already visible to anyone looking closely enough, and some of them ran through the family itself. Mary's childhood anxiety around money had never fully left her. It expressed itself now not as personal extravagance, but as an institutional seriousness so rigid it could shade into inflexibility. George's temperament was better suited to command than to comfort, and his relationships with his own children would later suggest a man more fluent in duty than in feeling. The Tech's debts and Florentine exile had been papered over by Mary's marriage, but the underlying vulnerability had not vanished. It had merely been transferred from the financial register to the political one. If the Techs had once been too poor to stay in England, they were now too German named to take their Englishness for granted. And the Battenbergs' need to prove their usefulness, Louis's 44 years in uniform, his wife's careful social navigation, their children's British births and British manners, carried within it the unspoken admission that what had been earned could also be revoked. These were not character flaws. They were structural conditions. The conditions of a family whose security rested not on thousands of ancestral acres, but on the continued willingness of the state to recognize their value. That willingness was about to be tested by a force that no amount of service, loyalty, or royal connection could withstand. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. The country that Louis of Battenberg served was now at war with the country whose name he carried. The court that Adolphus of Teck administered bore the name of German Duchy. The king's own house name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, belonged linguistically to the enemy. Within weeks, the question that had been invisible for 70 years became audible in every mess hall, every newspaper office, and every street corner where someone could read a headline, "Why did the British royal family have a German name?" And why did so many of the king's relatives still carry titles that sounded as though they belonged to the other side? The question was not academic. It carried with it the heat of a country sending its sons to die in Flanders, a country reading casualty lists over breakfast, a country that needed to know the people at the top were not secretly foreign. That need would express itself first as suspicion, then as hostility, then as violence. And the first person in the royal family to feel its force would be the man who had spent the longest proving he did not deserve it. The question would cost Louis of Battenberg his career before the year was out. It would cost the Tech brothers their inherited identity. It would cost the princess her rank and the family its language of self. And the man who would decide how those costs were distributed, who would be preserved, who would be translated, who would be quietly diminished, was the same man who had learned, in the navy and in the palace, that institutions endure when individuals submit to what is required of them. George was watching. He had not yet acted, but the machinery of decision was already turning inside a mind trained to value the crown above the family that wore it. The war was weeks old, and the first of his relatives was about to discover what that priority looked like up close. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. In the final weeks before the war, the world that these families inhabited had the solidity of something that had been standing for centuries and would stand for centuries more. It is worth returning to it briefly, not because the story can linger there, but because what followed will not land with its full weight unless the audience understands what was being destroyed. Louis of Battenberg, in the summer of 1914, was 60 years old and at the peak of a career that had consumed his adult life. As First Sea Lord, he occupied an office at the Admiralty in Whitehall, the institutional heart of the most powerful navy on earth, and his authority extended across a fleet that patrolled every ocean. He was responsible for readiness, for strategy, for the coordination of a naval force that Britain's empire could not survive without. His days were filled with signals, memoranda, fleet dispositions, intelligence reports, and the ceaseless administrative machinery of a service preparing, with increasing urgency, for a war that everyone in Whitehall could feel approaching. He was not a figurehead. He was a working professional in a role that demanded professional competence, and his competence had been tested repeatedly over 4 decades. The July crisis of 1914, when the assassination at Sarajevo set the diplomatic machinery of Europe grinding toward war, found Louis at his desk. It was Louis who, on his own initiative, kept the fleet concentrated after a test mobilization rather than allowing it to disperse, a decision that meant the Royal Navy was at full readiness when war was declared. That decision may have been one of the most consequential of the early war. It was made by a man whose name, within weeks, would be treated as evidence of disloyalty. His wife, Victoria, moved through a social world that was similarly confident of its own permanence. She corresponded with relatives in Darmstadt, in St. Petersburg, in Athens, the letters flowing along the postal routes that connected one royal household to another in a continuous conversation about marriages, births, court gossip, political shifts, and the health of grandmothers. She attended court functions at Buckingham Palace in Windsor, where the rituals of presentation and precedence unfolded with the weight of tradition and the precision of choreography. She maintained the network of connections that bound the family to the wider European royal system, a system in which a letter could travel from London to the Winter Palace by way of a shared grandmother, in which a cousin's christening in Hesse or a niece's wedding in Romania was as natural a fixture in the social calendar as Ascot or Goodwood. Her world was pan-European in a way that would soon become impossible, and she moved through it with the confidence of a woman who understood every room she entered. Her children were settled or settling. Alice was in Greece with Prince Andrew, raising a growing family. By 1914, she had 3 young daughters in the precarious orbit of Hellenic politics, a world of coup attempts and constitutional crises where the throne was never quite as stable as the palace furniture suggested. Louise was moving through London society with the grace expected of a Battenberg princess, attending drawing rooms and court presentations, her future still open, her rank still intact. George was following his father into the Navy, building the early stages of a career that mirrored the one Louis had built before him. The youngest Louis, not yet 14, was a boy whose world was still bounded by schoolrooms and summer holidays at Heiligenberg, the family's retreat in Hesse, a place of gardens and German conversation, and the kind of old world ease that within months would become enemy territory. The family was whole. The family was functioning. The family was, by every measure that mattered to the people living inside it, British. On the other side of the family's architecture, the Tech brothers occupied their positions with the same quiet assurance. Adolphus, governor of Windsor Castle, inhabited the ceremonial heart of the monarchy itself, the castle where the court gathered for Easter, where state dinners were held beneath Van Dykes and Canalettos, where foreign dignitaries were received, and the ancient rituals of royal hospitality played out in rooms that had witnessed the business of English kingship since William the Conqueror. He was 46, settled, embedded, a man whose daily life revolved around the management of an institution that seemed as permanent as the stone it was built from. Alexander, now 40, had already served with distinction in the Matabeleland campaign and the South African War and was building the record of imperial service that would eventually carry him to vice-regal appointments. Both men lived in England, both men served England, both men breathed English air and wore English uniforms and attended English church services and read English newspapers over English breakfasts. Their surname was the only German thing about them, and it was not a thing they had chosen. It was an inheritance. And inheritances, as they were about to learn, could be confiscated. Mary, watching from the palace, understood the vulnerability of that position more acutely than either of her brothers. She had learned, as a child watching her parents sink into debt and retreat to Florence, that names and titles were garments rather than skins, worn, not grown, and that garments could be stripped away by people who had the authority to decide what you were permitted to wear. Whether she articulated this to George in the months before the war is not recorded. What is recorded is that when the crisis came, she did not flinch. She did not plead for her brothers. She did not argue against a policy that would cost them their inherited identity. The institution came first. It always had. That was the lesson of the Tech childhood, hardened into principle and applied with the rigor of a woman who had spent her adult life ensuring that vulnerability would never touch her again. The war that arrived on August 4th, 1914, changed the temperature inside the royal household before it changed anything on paper. The declaration of hostilities with Germany created an immediate, visceral problem that had no precedent in modern British royal history. The reigning dynasty bore the name of the enemy's homeland. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was not merely a German name. It was a name that could be found on military maps of the country British soldiers were now being sent to fight. The absurdity was total. The king's official house name belonged linguistically to the other side. For the first weeks and months, the problem was managed by silence. Nobody raised it officially. The court did not address it. The press, consumed by the early campaigns and the staggering casualty lists arriving from France and Belgium, had larger concerns than genealogy. But the silence was not safety. It was a pause, the kind of pause that occurs before a structure that has been weakened begins to show its cracks. The first crack appeared at the Admiralty. In the autumn of 1914, as the war settled into the grinding reality of the Western Front and the Navy engaged in the early naval actions of the conflict, the press began to notice the first Sea Lord's ancestry. Letters appeared in newspapers. Questions were raised in conversation, in clubs, in the corridors of Westminster. A whispering campaign developed, not organized, not centrally directed, but persistent and corrosive. The logic it ran on was simple and brutal. How could the professional head of the Royal Navy be a man born in Austria with a German name? It did not matter that Louis had been a British subject for 46 years. It did not matter that he had entered the Navy as a teenager and built his entire adult life in British service. It did not matter that his decision to keep the fleet concentrated had placed Britain in a position of naval readiness at the war's outbreak. What mattered was the name. What mattered was the sound it made in the mouth of a country burying its dead. The resignation, when it came in late October 1914, was formally voluntary. Louis wrote to Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, offering to step down so that his continued presence would not distract from the work of the service he had spent his life building. The letter was dignified. It spoke of duty and of the greater good. It acknowledged the public mood without bitterness, at least on the surface. The circumstances beneath the dignified language were not dignified at all. He was being forced out, not by professional failure, not by incompetence, not by any deficiency that the Admiralty could identify or document. He was being forced out because his name sounded wrong in wartime, because the syllables of Battenberg, which had been unremarkable for 46 years, had become intolerable in a country counting its casualties. He was 60 years old. He had given 46 years of his life to a navy that was now in effect telling him that his biography was less important than his genealogy. The appointment that had been the vindication of a lifetime became, in a matter of weeks, the thing he was asked to surrender. Victoria sat with him afterwards. The sources do not say where, but the likelihood is their London home. And the conversation that passed between them is lost to history, though its substance can be inferred. A man stripped of the thing that defined him, a woman who had always known, at some level, that the system they served was capable of exactly this. The silence of the house after such a conversation has its own kind of weight. There is something about that sequence worth sitting with for a moment. A man spends nearly half a century proving he belongs. He rises through every rank the institution offers. He reaches the top. And then, within months, the institution decides that belonging was always conditional, that the decades of service counted for less than the syllables of a surname. The humiliation was not loud. It was administrative. It was a letter and an acceptance and a notice in the press and a successor appointed. But for Louis, the administrative quietness of the thing only made it crueler. There was nobody to argue with. There was no tribunal to appeal to. There was only the fact of a war and the fact of a name and the gap between what he had given and what that giving was worth when the public mood demanded a sacrifice. George V received the resignation without recorded protest. He understood the calculation. He may even have agreed with it. The crown could not afford to appear to be protecting a German-named official in a position of supreme military authority while British soldiers were dying in trenches from the Somme to Ypres. The political logic was clean. The human cost was Louis' to absorb. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. Though nobody had needed to say it aloud until now. The institution survived by deciding which parts of itself could be sacrificed, and Louis, despite his decades of service, despite the fleet readiness decision that may have altered the course of the war's opening weeks, was a part that could be spared. What followed the resignation was not the quiet retirement that the word voluntary implied. It was a kind of internal exile. Louis withdrew from public life. His health, which had been robust enough to sustain decades of naval command, began to deteriorate. The vigor that had characterized his years of service seemed to drain away, replaced by a heaviness that his family noticed, but that the public, consumed by the war, had no reason to observe. He was still a prince of Battenberg. He still held his rank. He still lived in the orbit of the royal family, but the thing that had given his life its structure and its meaning, the navy, the uniform, the daily rhythm of professional authority, had been taken from him, and no amount of royal proximity could substitute for it. Victoria watched her husband diminish. She did not speak publicly about the resignation, but her later correspondence reveals a woman who understood the full scope of what had been done, not just to Louis, but to the principle that had governed their lives. They had believed that service was the currency of belonging. They had believed that decades of loyalty purchased permanent acceptance. The resignation proved that the currency could be devalued overnight, that acceptance was not a right, but a license, revocable when the political arithmetic changed, that knowledge would color everything that followed. When the naming crisis arrived 3 years later, Victoria's response would carry the weight of a woman who had already been through one act of institutional betrayal and was watching the second one approach with the grim familiarity of a recurring nightmare. For Mary, the news of Louis's departure registered differently. She was not unsympathetic, as Louis was family, connected through the vast web of Victorian descent. But she was above all a pragmatist. The resignation confirmed what she had always sensed, that the family's position depended on the institution's willingness to maintain it, and that willingness could contract. The lesson she drew was not that the system was cruel. The lesson was that the system had to be managed, that the family needed to move before it was moved, to shed to what could not be defended before the public demanded it be torn away. That instinct would shape her response in 1917. The anti-German mood did not subside. After Louis's departure, it deepened. Through the winter of 1914 and into 1915, public hostility toward anyone and anything perceived as German intensified in proportion to the casualty list. German born shopkeepers were harassed, German sounding businesses were boycotted, Dachshunds were stoned in the street. The hatred was indiscriminate, irrational, and entirely real, and it carried within it a violence that would soon become physical. In May 1915, following the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger liner torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland with the loss of nearly 1,200 lives, including women and children, anti-German riots erupted across Britain. The sinking provided the spark, but the tinder had been accumulating for months. Casualty list, the sense of a war turning into a siege, the particular fury of a country that had not expected to be fighting at this scale and for this long. In London, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in towns and cities from the south coast to the industrial north, shops with German-sounding names were attacked. Windows were smashed with bricks and iron bars. Goods were looted or destroyed. Families were dragged into the street. In some cases, businesses that had operated for decades were burned out in a single night. The violence was not confined to immigrants. Naturalized British citizens of German descent, people who had lived in Britain for 30 years, who had married British spouses, who had British-born children, were beaten and abused because their surnames carried the wrong consonants. The violence was serious enough to reach Parliament. On May 17, 1915, members of the House of Commons discussed injuries, prosecutions, and compensation claims arising from the disturbances. The debate revealed the scope of the damage. Scores of businesses destroyed, hundreds of people displaced, injuries requiring hospital treatment, and a police force stretched beyond capacity by the scale of the disorder. The language in the House was measured and procedural. The language of governance attempting to contain a force that governance had not prevented. The reality on the streets was raw. It was hatred given permission by patriotism, and it was growing. For the Tech brothers and for Louis of Battenberg, the riots were not an abstraction. These were people being attacked for having German names. Adolphus of Tech had a German name. Alexander of Tech had a German name. Louis of Battenberg, already forced from the Admiralty, bore a German name that the press had already used as evidence of disloyalty. The question of whether the royal family was insulated from this kind of hatred by its position and its privilege was answered, implicitly, by Louis's resignation. It was not. Position and privilege could buy time. They could not buy immunity. George observed the riots and their aftermath with the cold institutional clarity that was his dominant mode. The violence was not directed at the royal family, not yet, but it demonstrated something that no amount of court protocol or aristocratic distance could neutralize. The public mood was national, visceral, and intensifying. The Lusitania riots showed the German names had become targets, that a surname alone could trigger violence. The king did not need to imagine what would happen if that hostility ever turned upward toward the throne. He needed only to read the newspapers. The evidence was in the broken glass. Through 1916 and into early 1917, the pressure continued to build, sustained by a war that showed no sign of ending and a death toll that had long since exceeded anything the country had been prepared to imagine. The Somme, Verdun, Jutland, Passchendaele still to come. The names of battles became the vocabulary of a national trauma. And against that background, the German ancestry of the royal family looked less like a genealogical curiosity and more like an affront. George and Mary toured hospitals. They visited factories. They made the gestures of wartime solidarity that the public expected, and those gestures were not insincere. George genuinely cared about his soldiers, in the blunt, inarticulate way of a man who had been trained to serve rather than to feel. But every photograph of the king in uniform, every public appearance of solidarity with the national effort, existed in implicit tension with the fact of his dynasty's name. He was asking a nation to fight Germany while bearing a German title. The contradiction could not hold indefinitely. By early 1917, a far more terrifying example of what could happen to a dynasty that failed to read the political weather had materialized with terrible speed. In Russia, the Romanov monarchy, closely related to the British royal family through multiple lines of marriage and descent, had collapsed. Tsar Nicholas II, George's first cousin and near physical double, had abdicated in March 1917. The imperial family was under arrest. The dynasty that had seemed as permanent as the Russian winter had been swept away by revolution in a matter of weeks. George watched that collapse with the particular attention of a man who understood that the distance between his throne and his cousins was not as great as geography suggested. The British monarchy was more popular, more constitutionally embedded, more deeply woven into the fabric of national life than the Romanov autocracy had been. But it was not invulnerable. No throne was. The Russian example demonstrated that a dynasty can survive centuries of war, famine, and internal discord and still be destroyed, almost overnight, when the gap between the rulers and the ruled grew too wide to cross. The implications for the naming question were immediate. If the public already mistrusted German-sounding associations at the top of the military, they would mistrust German-sounding associations at the top of the state. If the Romanovs could fall because they seemed distant and out of touch, then the British royals could not afford to seem foreign and out of step. The Romanov catastrophe did not cause the renaming, but it removed whatever cushion of complacency might have allowed the palace to delay. The question was no longer whether the names would change. The question was when and how and what the change would cost the people who bore them. And then came the raids. On June 13th, 1917, German Gotha bombers attacked London in daylight. It was the first major fixed-wing bombing raid on the capital, and the psychological impact far exceeded the military damage. The bombers crossed the English coast, flew up the Thames estuary in formation, and struck targets across the East End and the city. They hit Liverpool Street Station. They hit the Royal Albert Dock. And they hit with devastating precision Upper North Street School in Poplar, where a 50-kilogram bomb crashed through the roof of an infant classroom during morning lessons and exploded among children who were sitting at their desks. 18 children were killed. The youngest was 4 years old. Dozens more were injured. The scene afterwards, the shattered glass, the collapsed ceiling, the small bodies carried from the wreckage of what should have been the safest room in a child's day, they became one of the most emotionally devastating images of the entire home front war. The bombers were called Gothos. The word landed with a force that went beyond military terminology. Gotha was a city in Thuringia. Gotha was also part of the king's official house name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The coincidence was not engineered, but it did not need to be. It was enough. The name of the aircraft that had killed children in a London schoolroom was, by linguistic accident, the name attached to the British crown. The public heard Gotha and saw classroom debris. The public heard Gotha and remembered that the royal family carried the same word in its title. The association was politically radioactive. It made the renaming not merely advisable, but in the calculation of the palace, existentially necessary. Within days, the machinery began to move. On June 19th, the court circular, the official daily record of royal engagements, began to signal change. Royal relatives quietly dropped styles associated with German principalities. Schleswig-Holstein disappeared from the pages. By June 20th, the press was explaining that the king desired princes of his family who were British subjects and bore German names to relinquish those names and adopt British surnames. The language was euphemistic, almost gentle, the tone of an administrative notice rather than a crisis response. The reality beneath it was neither euphemistic nor gentle. The king was not making a suggestion. He was issuing an instruction, and the instruction carried within it a hierarchy of loss that the family could already feel. The further from the throne you stood, the more you would be asked to give up. Lord Stamfordham was at the center of the response. He had been preparing the ground for months, reading the public mood, advising the king, drafting and redrafting the language that would be needed when the moment came. Now, with the Gotha raids providing the final catalyst, the moment had arrived. Stamfordham consulted with the College of Arms about the mechanics of changing a royal house name, a process without clear precedent, since no British dynasty had voluntarily abandoned its own dynastic title before. He consulted with the Lord Chancellor's office about the legal framework. He consulted with the Home Secretary about the political temperature, and he began the process of selecting a name. The naming deliberations have acquired an almost comic quality in retrospect, but at the time they were deadly serious. Every candidate carried baggage. Tudor implied descent from a specific lineage that the current royal house did not share. Plantagenet was too antiquarian, too redolent of medieval pageantry. York and Lancaster carried the associations of civil war. England was too blunt, too presumptuous, as though the family were claiming the country as a personal possession. Fitzroy carried the stain of illegitimacy, since the prefix Fitz had historically been attached to the acknowledged natural children of kings. D'Este was absurdly itself foreign. Stamfordham moved through the options with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the name chosen would define the monarchy for generations. It had to sound English, it had to sound ancient, it had to sound as though it had always existed, as though it belonged to the landscape rather than to a family that had acquired it through calculation. The name that survived was Windsor. The Windsor Castle, 900 years of English kingship concentrated in a single word, a name that evoked stone walls, the Thames Valley, the Berkshire countryside, the deep territorial permanence of a country that had been governed from within those walls since William the Conqueror. The word carried no continental echo, no morganatic complication, no embarrassing association with enemy aircraft. It sounded quite simply as though it had always been the name of the royal house. That was its genius and its deception. Windsor was not a discovery. It was an invention, a word selected for what it was not, dressed in the appearance of what it had always been. The family could feel the policy approaching, like weather. Adolphus of Teck, at Windsor Castle, occupying the building whose name would become the family's, knew that his own name was on the list of those to be changed. He had served the crown his entire adult life. He had governed the castle. He had managed its ceremonies, welcomed its guests, maintained its traditions. And now the institution he had served was going to take his name from him and replace it with one chosen by committee. Alexander of Teck, in London, understood the same. He was a professional servant of the British state, a soldier, an administrator, a man who had fought in Britain's wars and administered Britain's colonial possessions. And the state was about to tell him that his surname was unacceptable. The irony was not lost on either brother. They were being reclassified as insufficiently British by the institution that knew better than any other how British they actually were. Louis of Battenberg, already carrying the scar of the 1914 resignation, understood that a second act of erasure was approaching. Not his career this time, his name. The very syllables that connected him to his father, his birthplace, his childhood, his ancestry, his sense of who he was, before Britain adopted him and before Britain decided that adoption was not enough. He was 63 years old. He had spent 49 years as a British subject, and the country he had served was going to translate him. To take the German sounds out of his mouth and replace them with English ones, as though identity were a document that could be amended by striking out one word and inserting another. Victoria of Hesse absorbed the approaching change with the controlled alertness of a woman who had been watching this unfold for 3 years and understood that protest was useless. She knew the system. She had been born inside it. She knew that it would do what it needed to do and that the people inside it would be expected to cooperate with their own diminishment. The younger generation, Louise, Alexander of Battenberg, the younger Louis, waited in the particular silence of people who have been told that something is going to happen to them and have not yet been told the precise shape it will take. By early July 1917, the preparations were complete. The new names had been selected. The new peerages had been designed. The proclamation had been drafted. The family knew that the announcement was imminent and that the king had made his decision. What none of them could quite have anticipated, and what the administrative language of court circulars and press notices had not prepared them for, was how compressed the timeline would be. How many lifetimes of inherited identity would be rewritten in a matter of days. How the quiet violence of bureaucratic translation would feel when it was applied not to abstractions, but to the name you had carried since birth, the name your father had carried, the name that connected you to a place and a history and a sense of self that no peerage patent could replace. The week of July 14th to 17th, 1917 was approaching. And with it, the most intimate act of political surgery the British monarchy had performed in living memory. The week began on Saturday, July 14th, 1917. That morning, Louis of Battenberg ceased to exist, not the man, but the name. By royal authority, Louis Alexander Battenberg became Louis Alexander Mountbatten and was simultaneously created Marquis of Milford Haven. The new title was Welsh in its geography, English in its language, and entirely free of the German sounds that had cost him his career 3 years earlier. The new surname, Mountbatten, was a translation, a rendering of Battenberg into English components, Mount for batten and Berg for, well, Berg. The word meant the same thing in both languages. Only the sounds had changed. Only the sounds had ever mattered. Louis was 63 years old. He had been a British subject for 49 years. He had served in the Royal Navy for 46. He had risen to the highest uniform position the service could offer, and he had been forced from that position because his name sounded German. And now the name itself was being taken. Not violently, not with guards or confiscation orders, but with the quiet administrative efficiency that characterized everything the palace did when it wanted something to appear painless. A peerage was offered as compensation, a marquisate. The rank was high, the gesture was generous, by the standards of the institution making it, and yet there was something about the transaction that resisted the language of generosity, because the thing being compensated for was not a material loss, it was an identity. Louis had been a Battenberg since birth. He had built his career, his marriage, his family, his sense of who he was under that name. The Marquessate of Milford Haven did not replace it. It papered over the place where it had been. On the same day, Alexander of Battenberg, the grandson of Queen Victoria through Princess Beatrice, born at Windsor Castle 30 years earlier, also became a Mountbatten. He was created Marquis of Carisbrooke. The title was new, the man was not. But the name he had carried for 3 decades was now officially gone. Alexander had grown up as a prince of Battenberg, educated in the expectations of minor European royalty, and had served in the British Army during the war with a record that included the retreat from Mons and service on the Western Front. He was not a man who had avoided the conflict. He was a man who had fought in it, under a name that the country he was fighting for decided was unacceptable. The irony was not subtle. It did not need to be. 2 days later, on July 16th, the Teck branch was translated. Adolphus, Duke of Teck, Governor of Windsor Castle, soldier, courtier, brother of Queen Mary, relinquished his German titles and was created Marquis of Cambridge. The choice of Cambridge was pointed. It recalled the family's maternal connection to the Duchess of Cambridge, George III's granddaughter, and it sounded English in the thorough university town way that Teck emphatically did not. Adolphus was 49. He had spent his adult life in British service. He had administered the very castle whose name was about to become the new dynasty's title. And now the state was telling him that his own name, the name of his father, the name of his grandfather, the name that had defined his family for generations, was no longer acceptable. He would be Cambridge. He would carry a new word in place of the old one, and the old one would be expected to disappear as though it had never existed. His brother Alexander underwent the same procedure on the same day. Alexander of Teck became Alexander Cambridge and was created Earl of Athlone. The earldom was a step below Adolphus's marquisate, reflecting the younger brother's junior position, but the essential operation was identical. A German name excised, a British title inserted, and the patient expected to recover without complaint. Alexander, characteristically, adapted. He had the Teck gift for institutional flexibility, the ability to accept what could not be changed and to redirect his energy toward whatever service the state required next. He would go on to serve as Governor General of South Africa and later of Canada, representing the crown under a name the crown had chosen for him. Whether the name felt like his own is a question the public record does not answer. The public record was not designed to capture that kind of pain. And then, on July 17th, the center held its own ceremony. At Buckingham Palace, on a July day in wartime London, the city still carrying the stale residue of air raid anxiety, the streets still bearing the memory of the Gotha bombs that had fallen 5 weeks earlier, George V signed the proclamation that declared the royal house and family would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor. The document also declared that all descendants of Queen Victoria who were subjects of the crown would relinquish their German titles and dignities. The language of the proclamation, published in the London Gazette, was formal, measured, constitutional, the prose of state authority performing an act of genealogical surgery with the anesthetic of bureaucratic syntax. It did not acknowledge loss, it did not mention sacrifice, it did not address the cousins, the brothers in law, the nieces and nephews who were being told, in the careful grammar of power, that what they had been called all their lives had become politically dangerous and that new names had been prepared for them. The red box, the desk, the pen, the signature, the weight of the words House of Windsor, arriving in print where Saxe Coburg and Gotha, was being silently, permanently buried. The document was bureaucratic in the way that acts of institutional violence are always bureaucratic. Clean on paper, devastating in the rooms where people read it and understood what it meant for them personally. There was no public ceremony, no balcony speech, no dramatic announcement to the nation. The proclamation appeared in the Gazette, was reported in the press, and settled over the family like a change in atmospheric pressure, invisible to the eye, but felt in the bones of everyone who lived inside its radius. George was 52 years old. He had been king for 7 years. He had watched his country go to war with nations ruled by his own cousins, had watched the casualty list grow beyond anything his generation had imagined possible, had watched a cousin's dynasty collapse in Russia with a speed that terrified every throne in Europe, had watched anti-German hatred burn through British streets and reach the floor of Parliament, and had concluded that the monarchy's survival required a particular kind of surgery, the removal of everything that connected the crown to Germany. The surgery was not performed with malice or with cruelty. It was performed with the grim institutional logic of a man who believed correctly that the alternative was worse. But the fact that the logic was sound did not make the operation painless. The people being operated on were his family. The anesthetic was duty. The recovery was expected to be silent. Mary's position during the proclamation week was one of the most psychologically complex in the entire family. She was the queen consort, the woman at the king's side, the institutional partner who had spent 24 years building the discipline and the composure that the role demanded. She was also a tech. The brothers being stripped of their German names were her brothers. The men she had grown up with at Kensington Palace and White Lodge and in those humiliating rented rooms in Florence. The family being translated from Württemberg into Cambridge was her natal family, the family whose insecurities had shaped her, whose debts had embarrassed her, whose precarious position had taught her the survival instincts she now deployed in service of the crown. She was, in the most literal sense, presiding over the dismantling of the world she had come from. Whether she felt conflict is not documented in any source that has survived with the clarity one might wish for. Biographers have inferred from her behavior a woman who subordinated private feeling to institutional duty with an efficiency that bordered on self-erasure. What is documented is her public composure, the unbroken surface, the continued presence at the king's side, the seamless performance of the role that the situation demanded. Mary did not protest. Mary did not plead for exceptions. Mary did not argue that her brothers had earned exemption through their years of service. She did what the institution required, and the institution required that she watch her brothers' names disappear without visible emotion. The cost of that composure is impossible to calculate from the outside. It is possible only to note that Mary had been trained for exactly this kind of sacrifice by a childhood that had taught her, above all else, that the institution matters more than the individual, and that the individual who forgets this lesson will be the first to be sacrificed. She had learned the lesson. She applied it. She applied it to her own family. The Florentine exile had taught her that dignity must survive embarrassment. The proclamation week taught her, or confirmed what she had always known, that dignity could also require complicity in the institution's cruelest decisions. The emotional responses of the family members were layered in ways that the administrative language of the proclamation did not capture. George felt, by every available indication, the grim satisfaction of a man who has done a difficult thing that he believes was necessary. He was not triumphant. He was not cruel. He was simply a man whose institutional convictions left no room for the kind of sentiment that might have softened the blow. Louise of Battenberg accepted the marquisate and the new name with the controlled resignation of a man who had already been through this once before, who had already lost his career to the same political logic, and who understood that protesting the name change would be as futile as protesting the resignation had been. Victoria of Hesse absorbed the change with the brittle composure of accumulated insult. For her, the week of July 14th to 17th was not a single event. It was the culmination of 3 years of institutional betrayal, beginning with Louis's forced departure from the Admiralty and ending with the erasure of the family name itself. The trajectory was clear and, in retrospect, inevitable. The system took what it needed. The family gave what was demanded. The transaction was complete. 2 days after the proclamation, on July 19th, 1917, Alexander Mountbatten, 5 days into his new identity, 9 days into his new title as Marquis of Carisbrooke, married Lady Irene Denison at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. The wedding was an aristocratic event in the traditional mode, the chapel intimate and candlelit, the guests in morning dress and military uniform, the clergy conducting the service with the unhurried solemnity of a ritual that had been performed in this room for centuries. Flowers, music, the prescribed words of the Anglican marriage service. The social apparatus of continuity doing its work as though nothing had changed, as though the family gathered in the pews was the same family it had been a fortnight earlier. But the groom walked into the chapel under a name that was less than a week old. The surname on the marriage register was one that had not existed in this form a month before. The man who signed it had been Prince Alexander of Battenberg until 9 days ago. Now he was the Marquis of Carisbrooke, and the identity recorded in what should have been one of the most permanent documents of his life, a marriage certificate, was an identity so new that the ink on his peerage patent was barely dry. The wedding that should have confirmed lineage and affirmed the continuity of a family's place in the social order instead quietly advertised rupture. A life event of permanence was being performed inside an identity of radical newness. If the guests registered the dissonance, and many of them would have understood it perfectly, being themselves members of the world that had just been rearranged, they did not remark on it publicly. That was the protocol. You carried on, you dressed properly, you signed the register, you pretended that the name you were writing had always been yours, and you trusted that eventually the pretense would harden into habit, and the habit into something that felt, if not quite like truth, then at least like something you could live with. The palace, meanwhile, was not finished. The July proclamation had changed the house name and forced the surrender of German titles by those family members who were British subjects. But the constitutional rewriting of the royal family had a second phase, and it was in some ways more consequential than the first. On November 30th, 1917, George V issued letters patent that redefined who was entitled to the style of Royal Highness and the title of Prince or Princess. The new role was sharp and narrow. The style would be confined to the children of the sovereign, the children of the sons of the sovereign, and the eldest living son of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. Everyone else, every more distant descendant, every collateral branch, every cousin and nephew and niece who had previously enjoyed the expansive umbrella of royal titling, was cut off. This was not merely a change of name. This was a change of category. The July proclamation had anglicized the dynasty. The November letters patent shrank it. George was not only making the family sound more British, he was making it smaller. And the smallness was the point. Fewer princes meant fewer people requiring state support, fewer people whose behavior could embarrass the crown, fewer people whose marriages required royal approval, fewer people who could claim, by virtue of style and title, a share of the institution's diminishing stock of public goodwill. The effect was to draw a tighter circle around the throne and to push everyone outside that circle into the ranks of ordinary, if titled, British society. The Battenbergs and texts had already been translated. Now they were being reclassified. They were no longer merely anglicized cousins. They were, in the eyes of the Constitution, no longer princes at all. The implications ripple outward. Louise Mountbatten, already demoted from princess to lady by the July changes, found her position confirmed and formalized. Any children born to the more distant branches would enter the world without the royal style that their parents or grandparents had enjoyed. The expansive, generous, endlessly proliferating royal family of Victoria's era, the family that had scattered princes and princesses across the continent like seeds, was being pruned back to a core. George's vision of the monarchy was not ornamental. It was functional, and functionality demanded that the institution shed weight, reduce its exposure, and present to the public a smaller, cleaner, more obviously British profile. The collateral damage was the people on the wrong side of the new line. The same month brought a separate but related piece of legislation that completed the legal architecture of the purge. The Titles Deprivation Act, which received royal assent on November 30th, 1917, gave the Crown the power to remove British peerages and titles from those who had borne arms against the United Kingdom or who had supported the enemy during the war. This statute did not target the Battenbergs or the Tecks. They had been on the British side throughout, but it operated in the same political atmosphere and reinforced the same message. German associations within the British honor system were being systematically excised. The Battenbergs and Tecks were accommodated, translated, compensated, and folded into British peerage structures. The enemy princes were simply stripped. The distinction mattered because it revealed the layered nature of George's policy. There was accommodation for useful relatives who happened to have German names. There was deprivation for those who had fought on the German side. And there was a general shrinking of royal style that affected everyone, useful or not, loyal or not, British in feeling or not. The system was being rationalized, and rationalization, like surgery, does not stop to ask whether the tissue being removed would prefer to remain. From here, the family's branches began to diverge in ways that the uniform language of proclamations and letters patent could not predict. Adolphus Cambridge, Marquis of Cambridge, remained at Windsor Castle, still governor, still ceremonial, still embedded in the institution that had renamed him. But the Cambridge title would prove fragile. Adolphus died in 1907. His son, the second Marquis, held a title until his own death in 1981, at which point the Marquessate became extinct. The senior Tech line, translated into Cambridge, lasted 2 generations and then vanished from the peerage entirely. The name that was meant to replace Tech proved even less durable than the name it replaced. Alexander Cambridge, Earl of Athlone, followed a different trajectory. He continued in imperial service, his new name functioning exactly as the palace had intended, as a neutral English-sounding label that allowed him to represent the crown in colonial settings without provoking questions about German ancestry. He served as Governor General of South Africa from 1924 to 1931 and of Canada from 1940 to 1946, performing the role with the competence and adaptability that had always been the Tech family's particular strength. Alexander proved that the policy worked institutionally, that a man could be renamed and continue to function, could carry a fabricated surname into the highest offices of imperial governance and serve without interruption. Whether the policy worked personally, whether Alexander ever felt entirely at home inside the name Cambridge, whether he ever stopped hearing the ghost of Tech beneath it, is a question his public record does not address. His public record was not designed to capture that kind of thing. The Carisbrooke line told a quieter and ultimately sadder story. Alexander Mountbatten, Marquis of Carisbrooke, lived out his life under the name he had acquired 5 days before his wedding. He and Lady Irene had one daughter, Lady Iris Mountbatten, but no son. When Alexander died in 1960, the Marquisate of Carisbrooke died with him. His branch of the forced reinvention became a genealogical dead end, a title created in compensation for an identity taken, extinguished within a single generation. The compensation had a shelf life, the loss did not. The Milford Haven branch, by contrast, endured. Louis Mountbatten, first Marquess, lived until 1921, only 4 years after the renaming, and died at 67, his health eroded by the accumulated strain of resignation, renaming, and the war itself. His eldest son, George, became the second Marquis of Milford Haven and continued the naval tradition. The title still exists, but it was through the younger children that the Battenberg legacy would prove most consequential. Princess Alice, already in Greece, was carrying the old world forward into a new geography. Her life after 1917 would include the birth of her son Philip in 1921, exile from Greece in 1922, years of separation from her family, treatment for psychological illness, a return to Athens during the Second World War, and acts of extraordinary moral courage, sheltering Jewish families during the Nazi occupation that would later earn her recognition as righteous among the nations. Alice did not experience the July 1917 renaming directly. Her formal style had already been changed by her marriage into the Greek royal house, but she carried the Battenberg identity, the memory of it, the emotional residue of it, the genealogical fact of it, and into the next generation and the next until it arrived, through her son, inside the British royal family itself. Princess Louise experienced the renaming as something closer to a personal demotion. She had been Princess Louise of Battenberg. After July 1917, she was Lady Louise Mountbatten. The shift from princess to lady was not merely grammatical. It was a social descent, legible to everyone in the world she inhabited, every hostess who addressed an invitation, every courtier who calculated precedence, every relative who understood the invisible gradations of rank that structured aristocratic life. Louise bore the change with the composure that her upbringing demanded, but the composure did not erase the fact. A woman born a princess had been made a lady by the stroke of a pen. Her marriage to Crown Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden in 1923 would restore her to royal status, but the restoration came from Stockholm, not from London. The institution that had demoted her did not reverse the demotion, a foreign throne did, and then there was the youngest Mountbatten, the boy who had been Prince Louis of Battenberg when the war began, and who was now at 17 simply Louis Mountbatten, the youngest son of the Marquis of Milford Haven. He was old enough to understand what had happened, old enough to feel the loss of the princely style, old enough to register the change in how the world addressed him and his family. He was also young enough for the new name to become, over time, the only name that mattered. Where his father experienced Mountbatten as a substitute, the younger Louis would experience it as a foundation. He entered the Royal Navy in 1913 as a cadet, following the path his father had walked before him, and began to build a career that would eventually surpass even the one that wartime xenophobia had cut short. The trajectory of that career is worth sketching briefly, because it reveals the deepest irony of the 1917 settlement. The younger Louis Mountbatten would become a captain, a commodore, a rear admiral, a vice admiral, an admiral of the fleet. He would command a destroyer flotilla in the Second World War. He would be appointed Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. He would oversee the British withdrawal from India as the last viceroy, presiding over the partition that ended 3 centuries of imperial rule. He would, in 1955, be appointed First Sea Lord, the same position his father had been forced to resign from in 1914. And the symmetry of that appointment was not lost on anyone who knew the family's history. And he would be created Earl Mountbatten of Burma, carrying the anglicized surname into the highest reaches of the British honor system, and transforming it from a name imposed by political crisis into a name synonymous with power, ambition, and the particular kind of aristocratic authority that 20th century Britain still, despite itself, deferred to. The name that had been a substitute became a brand. The brand became a dynasty of its own. The boy who had been stripped of his princely title in 1917 became arguably the most famous Mountbatten who ever lived. And the name that his father had accepted under duress became in his hands an instrument of influence that the old Battenberg title could never have provided. That was the paradox at the heart of the 1917 settlement, and it was already becoming visible by the early 1920s, though its full shape would not be clear for decades. The family had lost its old titles, its old names, its old position in the European royal hierarchy. The Battenbergs had been minor European royalty, constrained by morganatic origins and dependent on the tolerance of greater courts. The Tex had been royal adjacent, their status secured by proximity rather than primacy. Both branches had existed in a world where rank was inherited, fixed, and legible to anyone who understood the rules. That world had been destroyed, not by revolution, as in Russia, but by a king's decision that the world's rules no longer served the institution's needs. But what replaced it was not nothing. The Mountbattens were not the Battenbergs diminished. They were something different, a British political family unburdened by continental baggage, free to operate in the 20th century world of democracy, media, and public opinion in ways that a family still called Battenberg never could have done. The old name had been a ceiling as well as an identity. It had confined the family to the role of minor German royalty, dependent on the tolerance of the British court. The new name removed the ceiling and replaced it with a horizon. The erasure that had seemed in July 1917 like a wound was also, in a way that only became clear over decades, a liberation. The Cambridges gained less from the exchange. Their new name carried no particular energy, no political charge, no forward momentum. The Cambridge titles would prove administratively correct and emotionally inert, names that functioned without ever quite taking root. George V's settlement appeared to have worked. Windsor survived the war. The renamed relatives adapted, served, married, reproduced, and carried on with the disciplined composure that the system expected. The press moved on to other stories. The public forgot, so those who chose to forget, was that the House of Windsor had been invented in a week, that the people carrying its collateral titles had been something else entirely a month before, and that the whole arrangement had been driven not by tradition, but by panic. The machinery of forgetting was efficient, as it always is when institutions decide that the past must be rearranged to suit the present. Within a few years, Windsor sounded as though it had always been the name of the royal house. That was the intention. That was the achievement. That was the lie. Because the settlement contained within it a contradiction that no amount of institutional forgetting could resolve. The Battenberg blood had not been removed from the royal line. It had only been relabeled. Alice of Battenberg, Alice Mountbatten, Alice Princess Andrew of Greece, a woman who would carry 4 different forms of address across her lifetime, like luggage from a journey that never ended, was in Greece, and she was having children. In 1921, she would give birth to a son, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, on a dining room table on the island of Corfu. That child would grow up in the scattered, precarious, displaced world of exiled royalty, shuttled between relatives in England, France, and Germany, educated at schools chosen by uncles and cousins, a prince without a settled country, a Battenberg descendant without the Battenberg name. And he would one day stand before a naturalization board in London and adopt, as his British surname, the name Mountbatten, the same name his grandfather had been forced to accept as a replacement for the one he was born with. The name that had been politically downgraded in 1917 was making its way back toward the center of the dynasty. It was moving quietly through marriages and births and the patient accumulation of genealogical fact toward a destination that George V's proclamation had tried to make permanently inaccessible. The king had saved Windsor by erasing Battenberg. The family had absorbed the erasure and carried on. But the erased name had not stayed buried. It was alive inside the bloodline, carried forward by the women, by Victoria, by Alice, by the female lines that the patrilineal logic of monarchy so often overlooked. And it was approaching the throne with an inevitability that no proclamation could permanently deflect. The proof would arrive in 1947. And when it arrived, it would force the monarchy to confront the one question that the 1917 settlement had been designed to make permanently unnecessary. What happens when the name you erase becomes the name of the man your heir wants to marry? The years immediately following the proclamation moved with the deceptive orderliness of a family carrying on inside altered language. The new names appeared on court documents, in the London Gazette, on calling cards and official correspondence. Invitations were readdressed. Peerages were gazetted. The social machinery of aristocratic Britain absorbed the changes with the practiced indifference of a system accustomed to accommodating whatever the crown decided. The Marquis of Milford Haven, the Marquis of Cambridge, the Earl of Athlone, the Marquis of Carisbrooke. The names looked right. They sounded right. They occupied the correct positions in Debrets and Burkes. And beneath them, in the private spaces where names carry personal weight rather than institutional function, the people who bore them continued to live with the knowledge that what they were called now was not what they had been called before, and that the difference, however neatly the paperwork concealed it, was not a matter of choice. Louis Mountbatten, first Marquis of Milford Haven, did not recover. That sentence requires qualification, because recovery was not something the outward forms of his life would have suggested was needed. He retained his marquisate, he retained his residence, he retained his position within the extended royal family. He attended functions. He appeared in court photographs, By every visible measure, the settlement had worked, but the man inside the settlement was diminished. The resignation of 1914 had taken his career. The renaming of 1917 had taken his identity. Together, they constituted a dismantling, not violent, not dramatic, but thorough, of the structure that had given his life its shape and its purpose. He was 63 in July 1917. He lived for 4 more years. He died on September 11th, 1921, at the Naval and Military Club in London. He was 67 years old. The cause of death was heart failure, but the trajectory of his final years, the withdrawal, the erosion of vitality, the quiet fading of a man who had once commanded the most powerful navy on earth, suggested something that a medical certificate could not capture. He had been used up. The institution had taken what it needed from him: 46 years of service, a career, a name. And when the taking was done, what remained was not enough to sustain a life. Victoria survived him by nearly 3 decades. She lived until 1950, dying at Kensington Palace at the age of 87, a woman who had been born a princess of Hesse, had married a Battenberg, had watched her husband forced from office and renamed, had watched her family translated and diminished, and had lived long enough to see her grandson Philip marry the future Queen of England. Her life spanned the entire arc of this story. From the old European world of Queen Victoria's drawing rooms to the post-war monarchy of Elizabeth II, she carried the memory of what had been lost through every year of that span, and the memory did not soften with time. By several accounts, Victoria never fully forgave the institution for what it had done to Louis. The composure remained. The bitterness underneath it was permanent. Adolphus Cambridge, first Marquess of Cambridge, continued as governor of Windsor Castle until his death in 1927. He was 59. His life after the renaming was not unhappy in any dramatic sense. He was still embedded in the court, still performing his ceremonial functions, still occupying the rooms of the castle, whose name had become the dynasty's title. But there was a quiet irony in his position that the script should not overlook. Adolphus managed Windsor Castle under the name Cambridge. The building he administered bore the surname his family had been required to adopt for the royal house. He was, in effect, living inside the word that had replaced his own. A man called Cambridge, governing a castle called Windsor, both names imposed by the same political calculation, both functioning as substitutes for something German that had been judged unacceptable. His son, George, inherited the marquisate and held it until 1981, when it became extinct upon his death. 2 generations. That was all the Cambridge experiment lasted before the peerage vanished entirely, and the line that had been Tech for generations and Cambridge for 64 years ceased to register in the pages of the peerage at all. Alexander Cambridge, Earl of Athlone, followed the trajectory that the outline has already sketched: vice-regal service in South Africa and Canada, a career of conspicuous functionality, the model of a renamed relative who made the system work by working within it without complaint. He died in 1957 at the age of 82, having served the crown under his imposed name for 40 years. His wife, Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, lived until 1981, the last surviving grandchild of the old queen, a woman whose lifespan connected the Victorian world to the Thatcher era. The Athlone earldom survived Alexander, but did not perpetuate the Cambridge name in any dynastic sense. The Tech line, translated into Cambridge and elevated into the peerage, thinned out over the 20th century like a stream crossing dry ground, still flowing technically, but without the volume to sustain itself. Alexander Mountbatten, Marquess of Carisbrooke, lived until 1960. He and Lady Irene, the woman he had married under a 5-day-old name, had one daughter, Lady Iris Mountbatten, but no son. When Alexander died, the Marquessate died with him. The Carisbrooke branch became what the actuarial tables and the laws of male primogeniture had always made likely: a dead end. The title that had been created to compensate for the loss of Battenberg lasted 43 years and then ceased to exist. The compensation had an expiry date. The loss did not. These outcomes reveal the uneven architecture of George Fee's settlement with a clarity that the proclamation itself had not provided. The central monarchy, the House of Windsor, and survived and prospered. It became, over the course of the 20th century, one of the most recognizable institutional brands in the world. The name sounded ancient, it sounded English, it sounded as though it had been there since the castle was built. That was the settlement's greatest achievement. It made an invention feel like an inheritance. But the collateral branches that had been renamed and repackaged to protect the center did not share equally in that success. Milford Haven endured as a title. Cambridge became extinct. Carisbrooke became extinct. Athlone survived but did not perpetuate itself as a dynastic force. The pattern was unmistakable. The closer a branch remained to the center of power, the more likely it was to survive. The further it drifted into ordinary peerage life, into the quiet world of country houses and military service and marriages that produced daughters but not sons, the more likely it was to thin out, to lose its peerages, to be absorbed into the broader landscape of the British upper classes, and eventually to disappear from the peerage record entirely. George had saved the trunk by pruning the branches. Some of the pruned wood grew back in unexpected shapes. Most of it simply rotted away. But the most consequential thread in the entire saga was not running through the peerage columns of Debrett's or the pages of the court circular. It was running through a family scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, and it was about to produce the person who would bring the erased name back inside the walls of Buckingham Palace. Princess Alice of Battenberg, Alice Mountbatten, Alice Princess Andrew of Greece, had been living a life of extraordinary turbulence since her marriage to Prince Andrew of Greece in 1903. The Greek monarchy was, by the standards of European thrones, a precarious institution, established only in 1832, imposed by the great powers, interrupted by abdications and coups, buffeted by the Balkan Wars and the catastrophic entanglement in the First World War, and dependent on the tolerance of a political class and a military establishment that viewed the institution with varying degrees of enthusiasm, suspicion, and outright hostility. Alice and Andrew had settled into this volatile world and produced 4 daughters, Margarita, Theodora, Cecile, and Sophie, before on June 10, 1921, a son arrived. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was born on the dining room table of a villa called Mon Repos on the island of Corfu. The circumstances of his birth were not those of a child arriving into security and permanence. They were the circumstances of a family living in the margins of a monarchy that was itself living in the margins of political viability. 18 months after Philip's birth, the crisis arrived with the particular brutality that Greek politics reserved for its royal family. In the aftermath of Greece's catastrophic military defeat in the Greco-Turkish War of 1919-1922, a revolutionary committee seized power in Athens and arrested Prince Andrew along with several other senior military and political figures. 6 of the arrested men were executed. Andrew was court-martialed, found guilty of disobedience, and sentenced to permanent banishment from Greece. The intervention of King George V, acting through diplomatic channels and the dispatch of a Royal Navy cruiser, HMS Calypso, secured the family's evacuation. They left Corfu in December 1922, reportedly with the 18-month-old Philip carried off the island in an improvised cot fashioned from an orange crate. The image is almost too pointed to bear. The great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria, the grandson of a man who had commanded the Royal Navy, leaving his birthplace in a fruit box aboard a British warship. The exile was real. The displacement was total. The family that had been Battenberg had become Mountbatten, had married into Greek royalty, and had produced a child on a dining room table, was now rootless in the particular way that deposed royalty becomes rootless. Not sleeping in doorways, but dependent on the hospitality of relatives across Europe, scattered, without a fixed address or a stable income or a country to call home. What followed was a childhood of fragments. Andrew and Alice's marriage deteriorated under the weight of exile, financial insecurity, and the particular strain that displacement places on people whose identity has always been defined by the position they occupy. Andrew drifted toward the south of France, toward a life of exile that gradually hardened into permanent separation. He took a mistress. He retreated into the life of a man who had been a prince and was now simply a displaced person with expensive tastes and no country. Alice, under the compounding strain of marital disintegration, of displacement from everything she had known, of a personality that had always been intense and spiritually searching, experienced a severe psychological crisis in the late 1920s. The details are sensitive and not fully clear from the available sources. But what is known is this: Alice was diagnosed with what was then classified as schizophrenia. She was admitted to a sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland in 1930, and she remained institutionalized intermittently for several years. The treatment she received included methods that would later be regarded as crude and in some cases harmful. During this period, her contact with her children was limited. Philip, the youngest, was effectively parentless between the ages of about 9 and 12. His father absent in Monaco, his mother in treatment in Switzerland, his care distributed among the extended family, Mountbatten uncles in England, Milford Haven relatives, Hessian connections on the continent, the informal network of European royalty that absorbed displaced children with the efficiency of a system designed to handle exactly this kind of quiet emergency. Alice eventually recovered, though recovered is a word that sits uneasily on a life as complex as hers. She returned to Athens. She lived through the Second World War in occupied Greece. And during those years, she performed an act of moral courage that stands apart from anything else in this family story. She sheltered a Jewish family, Rachel Cohen, and two of her children in her Athens home during the Nazi occupation, hiding them from the Gestapo at personal risk. The act was quiet, it was dangerous, it was in its way entirely consistent with the personality that had been called ill by the medical establishment. A woman of intense conviction, of spiritual seriousness, of a willingness to act on principle that the institutional world around her had never quite known what to do with. Yad Vashem would later recognize her as righteous among the nations. She is the only member of the British royal family to have received that recognition. After the war, Alice founded a nursing order of Greek Orthodox nuns, the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary, and spent much of the rest of her life in religious service. She wore the gray habit of her order. She lived simply. She had traveled, over the course of 60 years, from Windsor Castle to a convent in Athens, from the drawing rooms of Queen Victoria's grandchildren to the austerity of a religious vocation embraced in late middle age. The journey was, in its way, the most complete expression of what the 1917 settlement had set in motion. A life dispersed by the forces of political identity, rebuilt on the foundations that had nothing to do with titles or surnames or the machinery of monarchy. Alice died in 1969 at Buckingham Palace, having been brought to London by her son Philip and daughter-in-law Elizabeth in 1967. She was buried, as she had wished, at the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. The Battenberg princess, who had been born at Windsor Castle, was laid to rest in the Holy Land, as far from the court of her childhood as it was possible to be. Philip, meanwhile, had been shaped by her absence almost as much as by her presence. He was sent to school in England, first Cheam, then Gordonstoun in Scotland. The school founded by Kurt Hahn on principles of physical toughness, self-reliance, and the particular kind of character building that involved cold showers, cross-country runs, and the expectation that boys would learn to endure discomfort without complaint. The school suited Philip. He was physically confident, competitive, restless, and equipped with the emotional self-sufficiency of a child who had learned early that the adults in his life were not always going to be there. His uncle, the younger Louis Mountbatten, now rising through the ranks of the Royal Navy, with the ambition and political skill that would make him one of the most powerful men in Britain, took an increasingly active interest in his nephew's upbringing and career. Mountbatten guided Philip toward the Navy with the same conviction that had driven the Battenberg men into British service for 3 generations. The pattern was repeating itself, a descendant of the erased German line proving his Britishness through naval uniform and professional competence, earning his place by service, just as his grandfather had done before the service was deemed insufficient. By the early 1940s, Philip was a serving officer in the Royal Navy, and the war gave him what his childhood had not: a structure, a purpose, and a theater in which his particular combination of physical courage, quick decision-making, and competitive intensity could be deployed to measurable effect. He served on convoy escort duties in the Indian Ocean. He was present at the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941, where his handling of the searchlights on HMS Valiant was mentioned in dispatches. He served in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. He was, by every account, a capable and brave officer, not a passenger trading on his connections, but a professional doing a dangerous job in dangerous waters. The war gave Philip the same thing the Navy had once given his grandfather Louis: proof of belonging. He had served, he had risked, he had earned in the currency that British institutional life respected above all others the right to be taken seriously. He was also, by the end of the war, a man of striking physical presence, tall, blond, athletic, with a directness of manner that some found refreshing and others found abrasive, and with the particular confidence of someone who has survived things that would have destroyed weaker constitutions. He had no money, he had no country technically, he had no permanent home. What he had was a bloodline that connected him to Queen Victoria, a surname that connected him to the 1917 settlement, and an uncle who understood, with a political instinct that was itself a Mountbatten inheritance, that the name could be turned from a historical liability into a dynastic asset if it were attached to the right marriage. The opportunity was Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth, eldest daughter of King George VI, heir presumptive to the British throne, had been introduced to Philip during a royal visit to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth in July 1939. She was 13. He was 18. The details of the meeting have been told often enough to acquire the patina of royal romance. The handsome cadet escorting the young princess around the college grounds, the beginning of a correspondence that would continue through the war years, the gradual deepening of something that had started as a teenage fascination and was becoming, by the mid-1940s, a serious attachment. Philip visited the royal family at Windsor and Balmoral. He was assessed, as all potential royal spouses are assessed, through the particular lens of institutional suitability, bloodline, character, religion, political implications. By 1946, with the war over and Elizabeth approaching her 21st birthday, the relationship had developed into something that required official attention. Philip asked George VI for his daughter's hand. The king, though cautious, protective, and not entirely comfortable with the Mountbatten connection, consented but insisted on a delay until after the royal family's tour of South Africa in early 1947. The engagement was announced on July 10th, 1947, and the announcement forced the palace, the government, and the family to confront the question that the 1917 settlement had been designed to make permanently unnecessary. What happened when a Mountbatten married the heir to the throne? Philip was a Mountbatten. The Mountbattens had been Battenbergs. The Battenbergs had been erased, renamed, compensated, and folded into the British peerage precisely so that their German identity would cease to be visible in the vicinity of the throne. And now a Mountbatten, the grandson of the very man who had been forced from the Admiralty and renamed, was proposing to marry the future Queen of England. The irony was structural and inescapable. The name that George V had buried was climbing out of the grave. In 1947, Philip formalized his British identity. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, became a naturalized British subject, and adopted the surname Mountbatten. The choice of name was deliberate and carried within it the full weight of the family's history. It was the name of the family that had raised him, the name of the uncle who had guided his career and who saw in Philip's royal marriage the culmination of a decades-long project to restore the Mountbatten name to the center of British power. It was also the name that connected Philip to his mother's side, the Battenberg side, the side that had been politically downgraded in 1917 and had spent 30 years quietly, persistently, rebuilding its position. Philip was not simply adopting a surname, he was inheriting a claim. The claim of a family that had been told it did not fully belong and had never accepted the verdict. On November 20th, 1947, Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten married Princess Elizabeth at Westminster Abbey. 2,000 guests, a ceremony broadcast by wireless to 200 million listeners worldwide. The pageantry of a nation still rationed, still gray with post-war austerity, welcoming a moment of color and celebration. The erased name entered the church on the groom's arm. The public did not, for the most part, register the irony. The name Mountbatten was, by 1947, simply a name. The name of a war hero's family. The name of the last viceroy. A name that sounded British and carried no visible German residue. The settlement had worked so thoroughly that the very thing it had been designed to conceal, the German origin of the name, was no longer visible to anyone who had not studied the family's history. George V had wanted the old names forgotten. They had been. And now the forgotten name was marrying the future queen. The marriage was celebrated. The public was charmed. The press coverage was extensive and largely favorable. But inside the palace, the implications of Philip's surname were causing a discomfort that would not surface publicly for several years. The issue was not personal. Nobody questioned Philip's suitability as a husband or his dedication to the crown. The issue was dynastic. If Elizabeth became queen and if Philip's surname were to follow the normal patrilineal convention, then the royal house would become the House of Mountbatten. The name that George V had extinguished in 1917 would become, through marriage and succession, the name of the dynasty itself. The erasure would be reversed. The settlement would be undone. The political surgery that had saved the monarchy in wartime would be nullified by a wedding in peacetime. The crisis arrived in February 1952, when George VI died and Elizabeth became queen. She was 25 years old, that Philip was 30. The question was immediate, urgent, and freighted with the accumulated weight of 35 years of dynastic politics. What was the name of the royal house? Under normal patrilineal convention, the convention that governed every other family in Britain, the house name would follow the husband's surname. The House of Windsor would become the House of Mountbatten. Philip's uncle, the Earl Mountbatten of Burma, apparently assumed, or at least hoped, that exactly this would happen. The story, repeated in multiple biographical sources and never definitively contradicted, is that Mountbatten remarked to friends and colleagues that the House of Mountbatten now reigned. The remark was not discreet. It was not intended to be. Mountbatten was a man of considerable ego and considerable political ambition, and the prospect that his family name, the name that his father had been forced to adopt under duress, would now become the name of the British dynasty represented for him a vindication so complete that he could not resist claiming it prematurely. The remark reached the ears of Queen Mary, by then 84 years old and in the final year of her life, and it provoked a reaction of fierce, almost visceral institutional resistance. Mary had lived through the 1917 settlement. She had watched her brothers lose their names. She had helped preside over the creation of Windsor. With the pragmatic ruthlessness that had defined her approach to monarchy since the day of her marriage, she understood, with the depth of a woman who had spent 60 years inside the institution, that the house name was not a personal possession to be transferred by marriage, but a political instrument to be defended at whatever cost the defense required. She was not going to watch it replaced by the very name that the settlement had been designed to bury. The fact that the name was now anglicized, that it carried no audible German inflection, that the public would not even have registered the significance of the change, none of this mattered to Mary. What mattered was the principle. The house was Windsor. It would remain Windsor. The alternative was unthinkable, not because it was dangerous. The political conditions of 1917 no longer applied, but because it would represent a reversal of the act that had, in Mary's view, saved the monarchy itself. Mary's intervention was decisive. She communicated her objection to the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who shared her view that the house must remain Windsor. Churchill advised the young queen accordingly. On April 9, 1952, Elizabeth II declared in council that the royal house would continue to be known as the House of Windsor. The Mountbatten name would not replace it. The 1917 settlement would hold. Philip's reaction, by the accounts that have reached the public through biographers and courtiers, was bitter. Perhaps the most openly bitter response he ever permitted himself regarding the institution he had married into. He is reported to have said that he was nothing more than an amoeba, the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. The exact phrasing varies across sources, but the substance is consistent and the feeling is unmistakable. He had given up his nationality, his royal titles, his Greek and Danish styles, and his family's original name to marry into the British monarchy. He had adopted the anglicized version of that name as an act of identification with the family that had raised him. And now the monarchy was telling him that even the anglicized version, the version that had been specifically designed to remove the German element, the version that existed precisely because the institution had demanded it, was unacceptable at the center of the dynasty. The rejection was not of Philip personally. It was of the name. It was of Mountbatten. It was, at its deepest and most structural level, of Battenberg, the ghost that had been buried in 1917 and that refused, across decades and through generations, to stay in the ground. Queen Mary died on March 24th, 1953, 10 weeks before the coronation of her granddaughter. She was 85. She had been born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, had become Queen Mary, had survived a settlement that erased her natal family's name, had helped enforce the 1952 declaration that preserved Windsor against the returning Mountbatten claim, and had died knowing that the house name she had spent her life defending was secure. Her final act of institutional protection was also her last act of personal continuity. A woman who had learned in the 1880s that names could be taken away, spending the final months of her life ensuring that the name she had helped create would not be taken back. The layers of erasure and defense had, by this point, accumulated so deeply that it was difficult to say where personal identity ended and institutional loyalty began. Perhaps for Mary, there had never been a boundary. Perhaps the institution had been her identity all along, and defending it had simply been a form of self-preservation. But the story was not finished. Philip's frustration had not been resolved. It had only been deferred. The House of Windsor remained Windsor. Philip remained Mountbatten. Their children bore the surname of neither parent in any publicly visible form. They were princes and princesses of the United Kingdom, styled by title rather than surname. The question of what name to write on documents that required a family name left diplomatically unaddressed. The compromise held because the circumstances did not yet require it to be tested. But the underlying tension between the Windsor identity that the institution demanded and the Mountbatten identity that Philip carried and that his uncle continued to press had not been eliminated. It had been suppressed, and suppressed tensions, in families as in constitutional arrangements, have a reliable habit of resurfacing when the pressure finds a crack. The crack would come in 1960, 8 years after the declaration, 7 years after Mary's death. And when it came, it would produce a solution so perfectly, painfully British, that it managed to satisfy nobody completely and offend nobody sufficiently. A hyphen inserted into the dynasty's identity, like a suture in a wound that the institution preferred to leave permanently visible rather than pretend had healed. On February 8th, 1960, Queen Elizabeth II issued an order in council that accomplished what no proclamation, no letters patent, and no act of institutional will had managed to do since 1917. It allowed the erased name back inside the dynasty. The order declared that while the royal house would remain the House of Windsor, that was not negotiable, had never been negotiable, and would not become negotiable. The personal surname of those descendants of Elizabeth and Philip who did not bear royal styles and titles would be Mountbatten Windsor. The hyphen was the compromise. The hyphen was the concession. The hyphen was, in its quiet, punctuational way, the acknowledgement that the 1917 settlement had not settled everything, that the name George V had buried had climbed back through the genealogical soil and demanded at a minimum a place in the paperwork. The timing of the declaration was not accidental. Elizabeth was expecting her third child, Prince Andrew, who would be born on February 19th, 11 days later, and the question of what surname to record on the birth certificate had become, once again, a matter requiring constitutional resolution. The 1952 declaration had preserved the House of Windsor, but had left the question of personal surnames, for non-titled descendants, diplomatically unaddressed. Now, with another child approaching, the ambiguity needed to be resolved. The 1960 declaration was the resolution, crafted with the precision of a constitutional instrument designed to satisfy competing demands without appearing to capitulate to any of them. The House of Windsor remained Windsor. That protected the legacy of 1917 and honored the position that Queen Mary and Churchill and the institutional establishment had fought to preserve 8 years earlier. But the personal surname of the non-royal descendants would carry Mountbatten alongside Windsor, hyphenated, subordinate in position, but present. Philip's name would not replace the dynasty's name. It would be embedded within it, Visible in the fine print of birth certificates and marriage registers and school enrollment forms, available to those descendants who needed a surname for the ordinary business of life, rather than a style for the ceremonial business of monarchy. The erased name had not been restored. It had been readmitted, on reduced terms, through a side door, with conditions that ensured it could never again threaten the institutional identity it had once been purged to protect. Elizabeth herself described the declaration, in language that has been reported through courtiers and biographers, as her personal wish, a desire that Philip's contribution to the family be recognized in the family's name. Whether the wish was entirely personal, or whether it also reflected the accumulated weight of Philip's frustration, Mountbatten's lobbying, and the simple practical reality that the children of the marriage needed a surname, the effect was the same. The name returned, not as a restoration, not as a vindication, but as a hyphen, the most British of compromises, granting just enough to silence the immediate complaint without conceding enough to alter the fundamental outcome. Whether Philip regarded the 1960 declaration as a victory or a consolation is a question that the available sources answer differently depending on who is telling the story. The Mountbatten camp, Philip's uncle and his uncle's allies, saw it as a partial restoration of a right that should never have been denied, a recognition that the Mountbatten contribution to the royal bloodline deserved formal acknowledgement. The Windsor establishment, as the courtiers, the constitutional advisors, the institutional memory of the palace, saw it as a minimal concession, carefully bounded, that changed nothing of substance about the identity of the royal house. Both readings were accurate, both were incomplete. The declaration was a compromise in the most exact sense of the word. It gave each side enough to claim satisfaction and not enough to claim triumph. The hyphen sat between the two names like a border between two countries that had agreed to stop fighting without ever agreeing on who owned the disputed territory. The declaration also illuminated something about the nature of the 1917 settlement that the intervening decades had gradually made visible, though nobody had quite articulated it in these terms before. George V had not eliminated the Battenberg identity. He had not even eliminated it as a political force within the institution he controlled. What he had done was something more subtle, and in the long run, more paradoxical. He had converted the Battenberg identity from a German royal name into a British political surname, from a diplomatic liability into an instrument of ambition, from something the institution needed to bury into something a family could use to build. The conversion was not intended. George had wanted erasure. He got translation. And translation, unlike erasure, preserves the original inside the new form, changed, disguised, but recoverable by anyone who knows the language. The Mountbattens had not been destroyed by 1917. They had been translated, and the translation had, paradoxically, given them access to forms of influence that the original Battenberg title, with its morganatic limitations, its continental confinement, and its dependence on the tolerance of courts that no longer existed, could never have provided. The old Battenberg name had been a ceiling as much as an identity. It defined the family's place in the hierarchy and simultaneously limited how far they could rise within it. The Mountbatten name removed the ceiling. It opened a door into the 20th century world of democratic politics, of media celebrity, of public service as personal brand. Earl Mountbatten of Burma understood this transformation better than anyone alive. His entire career, the naval command, the viceroyalty, the political connections, the social prominence, the careful cultivation of relationships with journalists and politicians and future kings, had been built on the translated name. His ambition to see the Mountbatten name attached to the royal house was not sentimental nostalgia for a lost German principality. It was strategy. The final move in a campaign that had lasted decades, aimed not at recovering what had been lost in 1917, but at converting the loss into something greater than the original possession. And the 1960 declaration was the furthest that strategy could reach. Not the full restoration he had wanted, not the House of Mountbatten he had prematurely claimed in 1952, but enough to prove that the family had survived the erasure and had forced its way through persistence and through the unanswerable logic of marriage and descent, back into the institutional structure that had tried to expel it. For a man of Mountbatten's temperament, enough was never truly enough. but it was what the institution was willing to give. And the institution, as his father had learned and as Philip had confirmed, always had the last word. The decades that followed the 1960 declaration carried the story forward through the texture of lived time, rather than the drama of proclamations and constitutional crises. The naming question, having been resolved, or at least suspended, by the Mountbatten-Windsor Compromise, receded from the foreground of the family's life and became part of the constitutional furniture, present but unexamined, the way a scar is present on a body that has learned to dress around it. Philip settled into the role of consort with a discipline that echoed across generations. The same code that had governed the Battenberg men since Louis first entered the Royal Navy in 1868: be useful, be visible, be serviceable, and do not complain about the terms on which your service is accepted. He supported the Queen through 69 years of public engagements, state visits, Commonwealth tours, and the relentless calendar of institutional obligation that defined the modern working monarchy. He attended approximately 22,000 solo engagements over the course of his public life. He was patron or president of more than 700 organizations. He developed the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, which became one of the most widely recognized youth programs in the world, operating in more than 140 countries and reaching millions of young people across 7 decades. He championed conservation before it was fashionable, spoke about environmental degradation at a time when the subject was considered eccentric for a member of the royal family, and brought to the role of consort a restless energy that refused to be confined to the ceremonial. He also said things in public that made the palace wince, remarks about foreign customs, about people's appearances, about the various indignities and absurdities of institutional life, and maintained a bluntness of manner that was either refreshing or offensive depending on the listener. That bluntness was not accidental. It was in its way the last remaining space in which Philip could assert an identity that the institution had otherwise absorbed. He had given up his nationality. He had given up his royal titles. He had given up the expectation that his surname would become the dynasty's name. What he kept was the right to speak as he found, to refuse the diplomatic evasions that the palace preferred, to be, in his public utterances at least, unmistakably himself. The institution tolerated it. The institution tolerated it because Philip's usefulness, his durability, his work rate, his willingness to carry the less glamorous burdens of royal life without complaint, outweighed the occasional embarrassment. The Battenberg bargain held service in exchange for acceptance, competence in exchange for belonging. Philip had inherited the terms and honored them for 73 years. He never entirely reconciled himself to the surname question. The frustration of the 1952 declaration and the partial consolation of 1960 remained by most accounts permanent features of his inner landscape. But he endured. Endurance, for this family, had always been the primary virtue, not because endurance is inherently noble, but because the alternative for people whose position depends on institutional tolerance is unthinkable. The Battenbergs had endured their morganatic status. The Techs had endured the debts and their Florentine exile. Mary had endured the erasure of her brothers' names with a composure that left no visible crack. Louis had endured the loss of his career and his identity and had died 4 years later diminished. Philip endured the loss of his surname's primacy and lived for 7 decades more inside the compromise. The pattern held across 4 generations: service, sacrifice, endurance, and the suppression of personal feeling in favor of institutional need. It was not a lesson, it was a condition of employment. The younger Louis Mountbatten, Earl Mountbatten of Burma, the last Viceroy of India, the former Supreme Allied Commander, the man who had carried the anglicized surname further and higher than anyone could have imagined when it was invented in July 1917, spent his later decades as a figure of immense social and political prominence, occupying a position at the intersection of royalty, military authority, and political influence that few individuals in 20th century Britain could match. He had overseen the partition of India in 1947, a process of staggering complexity and devastating human costs, resulting in the displacement of millions and the deaths of hundreds of thousands in communal violence. He had served as First Sea Lord from 1955 to 1959. holding the same position from which his father had been forced to resign in 1914 and completing in that appointment a symmetry so precise that it seemed to have been scripted. He had served as chief of the defense staff. He had advised prime ministers. He had cultivated a relationship with Prince Charles that was, by many accounts, the closest thing the young prince had to a mentor, a grandfather figure who understood the particular pressures of royal life because he had spent his own life navigating the boundary between royal blood and political ambition. Mountbatten was also a man of considerable ego, considerable vanity, and considerable talent for shaping the narrative of his own life. He commissioned authorized biographies and cooperated with sympathetic journalists. He gave carefully managed interviews. He managed his public image with an attentiveness that bordered on obsession, ensuring that the story told about the Mountbatten family was the story he wanted told, a story of brilliance, service, and the triumph of a family that had been knocked down by wartime politics and had risen again through sheer force of will and competence. The reality was more complicated than the narrative. His tenure as viceroy had been marked by decisions that historians continue to debate. His military record, while distinguished, was not without controversy. His personal life contained complexities that he preferred to keep from public view. But the narrative held because Mountbatten had the energy and the connections and the institutional position to sustain it, and held because the story of Battenberg to Mountbatten was, at its core, a genuinely remarkable arc of adaptation and recovery. His efforts to see the family name attached to the royal house had been, in part, an extension of this personality, a man who could not accept a subordinate position in any arena, and who saw in Philip's marriage the opportunity to complete the restoration that the 1917 settlement had interrupted. He had wanted the House of Mountbatten, he had been given a hyphen. The difference between the two was the distance between triumph and compromise, and Mountbatten understood the distance with the precision of a man who had spent his life measuring the gap between what he wanted and what the institution was willing to grant. On August 27, 1979, the distance became irrelevant. Mountbatten was killed by a bomb planted by the Provisional IRA on his fishing boat, Shadow V, at Mullimore in County Sligo, Ireland. He was 79 years old. Also killed were his 14-year-old grandson, Nicholas Knatchbull, a 15-year-old local boy named Paul Maxwell, who had been helping on the boat, and the Dowager Baroness Breborn, who died of her injuries the following day. The attack was calculated to produce maximum symbolic impact. The assassination of a member of the royal family, a former chief of the defense staff, a man whose name was synonymous with British imperial authority, and it achieved exactly what it intended. The funeral was held at Westminster Abbey. The nation mourned a man who had been, in his complex, ambitious, sometimes infuriating way, one of the defining figures of the century. Prince Charles, who had lost not just a great uncle, but a mentor, was reported to be devastated. Mountbatten's death carried a particular resonance within the arc of this story that no obituary could fully capture. The boy who had been Prince Louis of Battenberg, stripped of his princely style by his cousin the King's proclamation in 1917, who had grown up under a translated name and had turned that name into an instrument of extraordinary personal and political power, was killed by an act of political violence rooted in a conflict about national identity, colonial inheritance, and the legitimacy of British authority in Ireland. The themes that had defined the family story from its earliest chapters, identity, belonging, the politics of names, the violence that accompanies disputed questions of who belongs where and under what terms, were present in his death as they had been present in his life. The symmetry was not poetic, it was ugly, and it was lethal, but it was inescapable. Philip lived until April 9th, 2021, dying at Windsor Castle. The building whose name had replaced his family's, the building where his grandmother Victoria of Hesse had been born, the building that Adolphus of Teck had governed, while bearing a name that the castle's own title had superseded. At the age of 99, he had been married to the Queen for 73 years, the longest-serving consort in British royal history. He had been a naturalized British subject for 74 years. He had carried the Mountbatten name for the entirety of his British life, and that name had, through the 1960 declaration, been embedded inside the dynasty's official identity. He was given a funeral at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, attended by a small number of family members under the restrictions of the pandemic, and the image of the Queen sitting alone in the chapel pew. Masked, diminished by grief and by age, separated from her husband of 7 decades by the finality that no institutional arrangement can defer, became one of the defining images of the late reign. His death at Windsor Castle closed the last direct personal link to the generation that had experienced the consequences of the 1917 settlement at intimate range. Victoria of Hesse had died in 1950 at Kensington Palace, a Battenberg princess who had watched her husband forced from office and renamed and who had lived long enough to see her grandson marry the future queen. Alice had died in 1969 at Buckingham Palace, having been brought to London by Philip and Elizabeth 2 years earlier, a woman whose life had carried her from Windsor Castle to a Greek island, to a Swiss sanatorium, to Nazi-occupied Athens, to a Greek Orthodox convent, to finally the palace where her mother had been born. She was buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, in the crypt of the Church of Mary Magdalene, as she had wished, as far from the court circular and the world of proclamations and letters patent as it was possible to be. The younger Mountbatten had been killed in Ireland in 1979. Now Philip was gone. The generation that had known what Battenberg sounded like, that had carried the memory of the original names inside their bodies like a second skeleton, had passed entirely from the living world. What remained was the documentary residue, the name on the certificates, the hyphen in the surname, the constitutional architecture of a compromise that most of the public had long since ceased to notice, let alone to question. The 1917 story has received surprisingly little standalone dramatization, given its emotional and constitutional weight, and that absence is itself part of the story's meaning. The renaming of the British royal house, an act of identity surgery performed on a living dynasty in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, exists in the public imagination, not as a subject in its own right, but as a footnote within larger narratives. It appears in biographies of George V. It surfaces in histories of the First World War. It is mentioned in accounts of the Romanov collapse as a context for the pressures that were simultaneously bearing down on the British monarchy. But the family-level experience, the individual humiliations, the personal costs, the quiet bureaucratic violence inflicted on people who had spent decades proving they belonged, has never been the subject of a major dedicated screen treatment. The most prominent engagement with the material on screen comes in The Crown, Netflix's long-running dramatization of Elizabeth II's reign. The fifth season's episode Ipatiev House touches the 1917 atmosphere directly, using the Romanov murders as its entry point into the question of dynastic survival and the decisions George V made, or failed to make, regarding his Russian cousins. But The Crown approaches the Battenberg and Tech renaming obliquely, compressing the title politics into a subplot within a broader narrative about royal self-preservation. The specific experiences of Louis of Battenberg, of Adolphus and Alexander of Tech, of Louise and her social demotion, of Victoria of Hesse watching her husband diminish, these remain, in dramatic terms, largely unexplored. The individual threads that make the story a family tragedy rather than a constitutional curiosity have not yet found their screen equivalent. In print, the territory is better covered, but still far from exhausted, and much of the best work focuses on the political calculation rather than the personal cost. Alexandra Churchill's In the Eye of the Storm, George V and the Great War is one of the most significant nonfiction accounts, framing George's wartime monarchy as a pioneering exercise in what would now be called crisis communications and public relations, a sustained and deliberate effort to rebrand the institution for a democratic age, while the old aristocratic Europe was burning around it. Kenneth Rose's biography of George V provides detailed accounts of the naming deliberations. Philip Ziegler's biography of Mountbatten traces the afterlife of the translated name through the career of the man who turned it into a 20th century political brand. But the story as an integrated narrative, from Tech debts to Battenberg resignation, to Windsor proclamation, to Mountbatten Windsor hyphen, told through the lives of the individuals who experienced it, remains, for all practical purposes, untold in its full scope. That gap is itself revealing. The settlement worked so thoroughly that even the memory of what it cost has been absorbed into the institutional silence that surrounds the British monarchy's most effective acts of self reinvention. What remains now is layered, specific, and visible to anyone who chooses to look beneath the surface of the institution. The reigning monarch is Charles III, who acceded to the throne on September 8th, 2022, following the death of his mother, Elizabeth II, at Balmoral Castle. He is 77 years old. He is a descendant of the Battenberg line through his father, Prince Philip, and through Philip's mother, Princess Alice, the woman born at Windsor Castle in 1885, institutionalized in Switzerland in the 1930s, recognized as righteous among the nations for sheltering Jewish families in Athens, and buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. The German bloodline that George V spent the summer of 1917 trying to render invisible inside the British monarchy has become, through the ordinary mechanics of descent, an inescapable part of the current king's ancestry. Charles is a Windsor by house. He is a Mountbatten Windsor by personal surname when a surname is required. He is a Battenberg by genealogical fact. The three names, the original, the translation, and the institutional label, coexist inside a single person. And that coexistence is not accidental. It is the product of a century of naming, renaming, erasing, and partially restoring, each act layered on top of the last, like geological strata, each one visible to anyone willing to dig. The clearest repeating pattern across the generations is service, followed by conditional acceptance. Louis of Battenberg served Britain for 46 years and was still made suspect when the political weather turned. Philip served Britain for 74 years and was accepted, but only after renouncing his nationality, his royal titles, and his family's original name. And even then, the acceptance did not extend to allowing his surname to become the dynasty's name. The inheritance that passes through this family is not wealth in the conventional sense. It is adaptation, the learned capacity to absorb institutional demands, to reshape oneself to fit the institution's requirements, to carry on under altered conditions without public complaint. Mary learned it watching her parents' debts consume their dignity. George learned it in the Navy. Louis learned it through resignation and renaming. Philip learned it through naturalization and the 1952 Declaration. Each generation inherited not an estate or a fortune, but a set of instructions for surviving inside a system that reserves the right to redefine the terms of belonging at any time. The House of Windsor remains the official name of the royal house. That has not changed since July 17, 1917, and shows no sign of changing. The Mountbatten Windsor surname remains constitutionally available to descendants of Elizabeth II and Philip who require a personal surname. Those without royal styles and titles, or those who choose to use it on official documents. The Milford Haven Marquisate still exists, held within the Mountbatten line by the descendants of Louis's elder son George. The Cambridge Marquisate, created for Adolphus of Teck in 1917, became extinct upon the death of the second Marquess in 1981. The Carisbrooke Marquisate, created for Alexander of Battenberg in the same week, became extinct upon Alexander's death in 1960. The Athlone earldom survived its creator, but did not produce a lasting dynastic presence. The titles that were created in 1917 to compensate for the loss of Battenberg and Teck have, with one exception, followed those original names into extinction. The compensation, it turns out, had a shorter shelf life than the loss it was designed to address, and yet the female lines carried the buried story forward with an efficiency that the patrilineal system never anticipated. Victoria of Hesse transmitted the Battenberg connection to Alice. Alice transmitted it to Philip. Philip transmitted it to Charles, to Andrew, to Edward, to Anne. Charles transmitted it to William and to Harry. The supposedly erased identity is now embedded in the bloodline of every member of the direct royal line, and the name that George V tried to bury is carried, in hyphenated form, in the official surname of the dynasty's non-titled descendants. The foreign blood was never removed. Only the language around it changed, and even the language eventually changed back, not fully, not proudly, not as a restoration, but as a hyphen, a small mark, a permanent scar. What this family story reveals is not simply that monarchy is theatrical, though it is modelling profoundly, rigorously, and with a technical sophistication that would be admirable if it were not also at times so coldly effective. What it reveals is that monarchy is administrative in the deepest sense. It survives by deciding which parts of its own past can be carried forward and which must be cut loose, which relatives can be kept at the center and which must absorb the loss so the center can hold. George V did not save the crown by becoming less German on his own. He saved it by asking his relatives to become less themselves, to surrender names, titles, styles, and the accumulated identity of lifetime so that the institution at the center of their world could survive a political crisis it had not caused and could not control. The strange, almost perfect final image is that the buried name did not stay buried. It came back, not as a restoration, not as a full return, not as a reversal of the 1917 settlement or a vindication of the family members who had been diminished by it. It came back as a hyphen, a small, almost invisible mark between two words on a legal document, carrying inside it the entire weight of a century's worth of erasure, adaptation, survival, and the particular British genius for finding a compromise that resolves nothing but allows everyone to carry on. Not a healing, just enough of the old wound left visible to prove it was never going to heal completely. That is not a lesson, that is just a dynasty.